Welcome to the third in the series of the Reparation Information Thought Series, a periodic strategic webinar featuring reparations experts, racial justice thought leaders, and you engaged in critical discussion, reflection, and analysis on issues pertinent to the movement for reparatory justice in the United States. We are proud to co-host this. It's co-hosted by my colleague, Jessica. And Jessica, introduce yourself. I'll introduce myself, and then we'll introduce the panelists for this part of the series.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, founder of the National Black Cultural Information Trust. We share news, resources, and information that uplifts the collective freedom of Black communities.
Okay, and I am Nkechi Taifa, the Executive Director of the Reparation Education Project, and I am the author of the newly published book called Reparations on Fire, How and Why It's Spreading Across America. And this is the third of our thought series. The first one was called The Weaponization of Race and Reparations and How to Combat It. We had as panelists Aiwuyor, we had Jeffrey Robinson, and we had commentary by Lisa Holder as well. Jeffrey Robinson from the Who We Are Project was part of that panel. The next in the series was called Comprehensive Reparations, a Blueprint for Reparatory Justice in the United States. And our feature presenter was none other than our co-host here, Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor. And this third in the series of the Reparation Information Thought Series is Lineage Burden of Proof. Lineage Burden of Proof, yes, indeed. And this is a very important topic, and I am pleased and honored to have our featured presenters. We have three featured presenters, and we're going to be introducing them. And then we're going to engage in commentary back and forth. You will have the opportunity at the conclusion of the discussion to put Q&A in the Q&A box, and we will be doing Q&A at the conclusion of this series. So let's just get started with introductions. Jessica, why don't you introduce Baba AK first, Akinyele Umoja.
Sure. Right when my notes are not in front of me. Okay. All right, so we have with us today Dr. Akinyele Umoja, who is a professor of African American Studies at Georgia State University. Umoja is the author of We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance, and the Mississippi Freedom Movement, named the 2014 Anna Julia Cooper CLR James Award for the Best Book in Africana Studies by the National Council of Black Studies. We Will Shoot Back also earned the 2014 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Excellence in Literature. He is also co-editor of Greenwood Press Black Power Encyclopedia, which was named on the Reference and User Services Association, a division of the American Library Association, 2019 list of outstanding references for adults. Umoja also is the editor of a special issue of the Black Scholar in 2018 on the legacy of his comrade, revolutionary activist, attorney, and late mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, the Honorable Chokwe Lumumba. Umoja's research has also been featured in several other journals and anthologies. Professor Umoja is also very engaged in social justice advocacy, along with his wife, Aminata, and other comrades. Umoja organized Atlanta's Malcolm X Festival in 1989, which is now attended by thousands annually. Umoja received acknowledgement from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists in 1998 and the National Council of Black Studies 2008 for his activism. Due to his civic engagement and scholar activism, he was inducted into Selma, Alabama's Hall of Resistance in the Enslavement and Civil War Museum during the annual Bridge Crossing and Jubilee celebration. Other inductees into the Hall of Resistance include author Sonia Sanchez and scholar activist Asa Hilliard, Malana Karenga, and legendary hip hop artist Tupac Shakur. So welcome, Professor Akinyele Umoja.
Thank you.
Welcome, Baba Akinyele Umoja, Doctor. And I would like to now introduce Dr. Ray Winbush, who is the research professor and director of the Institute for Urban Research. And as a scholar and activist, he is known for his systems thinking approaches to understanding the impact of racism, white supremacy on the global African community. His writings, his consultations, his research have been instrumental in understanding developmental stages in Black males, public policy, and its connection to compensatory justice, relationship between Black males and females, infusion of African studies into school curriculum, and the impact of hip hop culture on the contemporary American landscape. And I might add, I don't think I mentioned, is Morgan State University research professor and director. He is the author of the pivotal books long before many people were even talking about the issue of reparations. He authored the book, and it's right there behind his in his bookcase, Should America Pay? Slavery and the Raging Debate on Reparations, published in 2003. His next book, which actually is considered a prequel to Should America Pay, is called Belinda's Petition, A Concise History of Reparations, from the transatlantic slave trade. And I say like precursor on how reparations from the transatlantic slave trade has been a consistent theme among African people for the past 500 years. And I mentioned this about Belinda's petition. We hear a lot now about Belinda Sutton Royal. We know about Mary Frances Welsing's book on My Face is Black is True. That was Callie House. But again, Ray was there on this issue, writing books, putting out information like this long before it has come to its area of popular ascendancy in the across the country. And now I'd like to also introduce Professor Natsu Taylor Saito. She will be presenting via video. But I will introduce her at this time as well. She is an activist, attorney, and a Regents Professor Emerita at Georgia State University, where she taught courses on race, indigeneity. My tongue has been colonized, folks, but indigenous, right? Okay, indigeneity, and human rights for almost 3 years. She is the author of 3 books, most recently, Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists. A former community organizer, Natsu remains involved in efforts to defend Indigenous rights, contest police misconduct, and protect academic freedom. So with that, let's go on and get this discussion started. And we're going to get started with, I'm going to just present a question and let each of you all take, about 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes or whatever, to respond to the question. And then we will be engaged in conversation back and forth. So again, our theme for this webinar is Lineage Burden of Proof, Difficult, Divisive, and Under-Inclusive. So our leading question is, and actually, before I do the question, Jessica Jam, could you just please explain the topic of limited access reparations? Because the question is going to center around the issue of lineage, which we are also calling limited basis, limited access reparations. So can you just briefly explain that before I tender the question?
Sure. So essentially, what people are advocating for, what certain people are advocating for when they use the terminology of lineage-based reparations, it's really a type of limited access reparations. And I can go into this more after our presenters discuss this, but essentially it's limiting access to various portions of the population and creating barriers to being able to gain access or entry to reparative justice. And this can formulate itself in a number of different ways, but currently, the most popularized version of this is creating a lineage standard based on being able to have or prove that you have an ancestor that was enslaved through some sort of paperwork or documentation, and not being able to prove that you have this ancestry, or not having the specific documentation, or even having to wait to gain this documentation before you can get access to reparative justice, thereby limits the access and limits the ability to get full repair.
Okay, thank you so very much, Jam. So the question is, why are lineage-based or limited access reparations problematic for large-scale reparations initiatives? And you can respond in about 7 minutes in any way that you feel necessary to discuss your position on that. And which one of you all would like to start?
I could go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay,
go ahead.
Dr. Akinyele Umoja, you have the floor.
All right. This whole question reminds me of when I was an undergraduate and I had a course called, well, first of all, I didn't start correctly. In the name of our mothers, fathers, all our ancestors, I greet you and appreciate being brought on here by Sister Jessica and Sister Mama Nkechi. And also I'm a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, and we always start with free the land. But I'm reminded, this conversation reminds me of when I was in college and I took a class called, I'm not a baby. I was in college in the 70s, and I took a class called The Black Family. And we were given an assignment to trace our genealogy. And I was fortunate. My grandmother gave me quite a list. And then later on, I was able to connect with one of my aunts who was a lay genealogist, and she had a lot of information. My dad had a lot in his memory. And so I was able to go in the class back to at least 1860. I was the only person in that class in the 1970s who could do that, except for a white girl who was in the class and went back England several generations. And why could a white girl do it and we couldn't do it? Because people who come from enslaved and colonized lineages, a lot of times things are disrupted in terms of our families. We're disconnected and things of that nature. So if the burden is on me, or burden is on people in our community who don't have certain resources, a lot of our people will be eliminated. To me, the question, and I know in one of the local commissions here in the Metro Atlanta area, I don't want to mention which one, but someone was raising this question of lineage, and there was some pushback. The first thing we got to do, and we got to remember, what is reparations? A lot of times I think people are just thinking money and checks. And it's a question that's broader than that under international law, number one. And it's about us repairing ourselves as a people, right? A people, and it's about, I think we have to start with, what is the injury? What were the harms being done? And then who was harmed? And it might be, the harms might look different for different atrocities. If you're talking about racial slavery, or what folks call chattel slavery, then there's a specific harm to members of that class whose ancestors were harmed by that, and we're still harmed, right? The trauma still goes on from generation to generation. But then you talk about structural racism, which I remember in the document that Nkechi is in Nkechi's recent book, where Nkechi, Mario Bodeli, and Chokwe Lumumba talked about the vestiges of slavery. Okay, when we talk about white supremacy post-slavery, when we talk about the apartheid system that existed in the South, in different parts of the country, when we talk about redlining, and if we look at like the work that's been done in Evanston, they're specifically looking at redlining. That's a part of our reparations fight, because I don't see reparations as just one bill. I don't see it as one effort. I remember Baba Chokwe, before he passed, spoke on reparations one time, and he saw reparations as a stage in our fight for human rights. And we're going to fight it on a variety of levels. It might be one grand one, but it's going to be on a bunch of different levels, the reparations will be fought. So rather than us fighting based on the 14th Amendment that our enemies are using now, saying we can't get certain things because you can't separate and give one quote unquote citizen one thing and not give the other citizen something else. I think Chokwe made the argument that we have to point to international law, and we also have to look at, after the 13th Amendment, no remedies were brought about. If folks are about to celebrate Juneteenth, and General Granger, when he had Juneteenth, he basically told folks to go back and work for their former slave holders, right? Their former captors. And so we have to look at reparations to challenge that, not dealing with providing us with access to repair and providing us with justice after that, the harm that was created through capturing our ancestors, bringing us here, denying us self-determination, and denying us our human rights, as well as the unjust enrichment that occurred in the society due to that. I'm gonna stop now because I've been talking for a minute. But so basically, I think the onus shouldn't be on us to prove it, but we need to do the research, and that's what I think these commissions primarily should be about, to identify the harms and really engage in a lot of conversations in our community to get us mobilized around the whole question as well.
All right, thank you so very much, Dr. Umoja. Let's turn now to Dr. Raymond Winbush. What are your thoughts and reflections on this?
Well, again, I echo AK. Thanks for inviting me to this. I think it's an important discussion. And so I'm going to jump right into it. And I wrote my remarks down deliberately because I've been misquoted so much by, I don't want to get into that now, but we will during the discussion. Now, I don't know if it's really a misquote as much as a deliberate distortion. But anyway, the first of the many logical absurdities of eligibility tests for reparation is that no such criteria were applied to us when we were captured in Africa. The only eligibility requirement that Europeans have for enslaving us was the color of our skin. They didn't ask if we were Asante, Yoruba, Igbo, Mandinka, or Shona. So far from honoring our ancestors who deserve reparation, that's a direct quote from some of these lineage people, we dishonor them by using European and American records that were often distorted, destroyed, and falsified to exonerate those who were enslaving us. An excellent example of these illegal acts occurred while I taught at Fisk University during the late 1990s. The Race Relations Institute, which I directed, partnered with the Associated Press, and together we conducted a nationwide study on Black people and their ancestors whose land was stolen from them by white supremacists during the 20th century. The study, entitled Torn from the Land, can still be found online, and a summary in my book, Should America Pay Slavery and the Raging Debate on Reparations. One of the study's unexpected findings was the discovery of the deliberate destruction of Black people's deeds, birth, and death certificates of Black people by white supremacists in order to rob them of their land. These were mostly done at the county level, where county commissioners and politicians collaborated to make sure it would be complicated for Black people to prove they own land, but in many cases difficult to even prove where and when they were born, and even their ancestral lineage. The malicious and illegal destruction of documents that could corroborate the lineage of American Africans links to the enslavement is far more prevalent than one might imagine. Secondly, many American Africans simply don't have the means and wherewithal to trace their lineage to enslavement. Money, travel, internet availability, lost family records, and access to government records are but some of the challenges our people must face in proving their links to enslavement. Lineage advocates seem indifferent to the circumstances of the very people they purport to be advocating for, those of our people who have intergenerational injuries due to enslavement. The lineage advocates, whom I call I could call another, but anyway, sound eerily like the slave catchers during enslavement who roamed the back roads of the South and stopped enslaved people from reaching their destinations unless they could produce papers written by their enslavers proving that their travel was legitimate. They also echo the infamous pass laws that were part of South Africa's way of controlling how Black folk move from one neighborhood to another. Thirdly, not only are the lineage folk advocating white legal documentation to make our people eligible for reparations, but they are also pathologically anti-Pan-African. I've been, really shocked about how online you see people saying, we don't use that word African, leave that word out of it. You would never see an Irish person or an Italian say something like that. But, I'm going to stay on point. While doing the work of the white supremacists, these lineage organizations also attempt to minimize the historical contributions of African scholars and political leaders, both alive and dead. The reparations struggle has always been a global struggle for justice, mounted by Africans on the continent, in the Caribbean, Europe, and the Americas. The cooperation of the African diaspora in seeking reparation is reflected in the Pan-African Congresses during the 20th century, the global African push for reparations at the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism, and continues today with the collaborative work of NCOBRA, with CARICOM in the Caribbean, and organizing immigrated Africans from the continent who have worked with their brothers and sisters in Boston, California, and elsewhere to obtain reparations for Africans in America. Finally, and this may be one of my most important points, finally, the only other time in my lifetime that I have seen Black people employ violent language and behavior, harassment, intimidation, and physical force is during the infamous COINTEL era of the late 1960s and 1970s. We witnessed shootouts at UCLA between the Black Panthers and us. Government infiltration occurred with the FBI using people like William O'Neill to betray Fred Hampton in Chicago. We know now that much of the conflict and violence of that period was orchestrated by the federal government's FBI and in some cases the CIA. In years to come, let's hope that we won't discover the same thing about those who claim to be seeking justice in the form of reparations, but in fact are using tactics identical to what we witnessed during the COINTELPRO era. That's it.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Dr. Ray Winbush. And right now we're going to go to a video presentation by Professor Natsu Saito.
This is a really critical question, and I'm really honored to be able to participate in this discussion about it. My Japanese American family was interned during World War II. And while I've become a staunch advocate of reparations, in that case, initially, I was very skeptical. The government knew what it was doing. What good, I thought, would an apology from Ronald Reagan do? Luckily, the movement wasn't waiting on my approval, and I got to see how important it was to have the public acknowledgement that the internment had been wrong, educational materials to keep our history from being erased, and compensation that, while merely symbolic, was nonetheless tangible. Perhaps most importantly, redress allowed many people who had been incarcerated to be able to talk about their experiences without shame for the first time in 40 years. But that experience also highlighted some pitfalls of redress and reparations. One is that the reparations themselves can undermine acknowledgement of the wrong. In that case, in Congress, the redress bill was justified by the loyalty we had demonstrated, basically by herding ourselves into concentration camps. We were being rewarded for accommodating rather than resisting the wrong. Another is that it can, and in this case did, exacerbate inter and intra-group divisions. It was used to highlight Japanese Americans as a model minority, a trope that was developed explicitly to blame Black and Brown communities for their dispossession. And compromises were made to exclude various classes of people, including thousands of Japanese Latin Americans who were kidnapped and interned in the US and then excluded from redress because they were, quote, illegal aliens. Their struggles for redress continue 35 years later. The goal of reparations is to make whole, and as international law recognizes, it should be a wide-ranging process that encompasses restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. At the same time, we know that the perpetrators of wrongs, states in this case, are not going to fix the problems that result from any large-scale historical injustice. So for me, there's three key elements that we need to consider in struggling for reparations: truth, dignity, and power. Are we exposing historical truths? Are we enhancing human dignity? And does the process as well as the result empower those who are harmed by the violations? To get there, we have to ask, what are the wrongs at issue? What would it take to repair their consequences? And do the interim steps we advocate lead us toward our ultimate goals, or will they short-circuit the process? Based on what I understand about proposals to limit reparations for slavery to lineal descendants of enslaved Africans in what is now the United States, I have several concerns. The main problem I see is that this proposal makes it easy to disregard the pervasive social harm that the legacy of centuries of enslavement has produced. A lot of folks have made that case, so I won't belabor it, but I'd like to highlight the importance in this discussion of the 2001 Durban Declaration and more recently, the 2019 report on reparations by Tendai Yachime, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, both of which emphasize the ongoing legacies of colonialism and enslavement. A second problem is that while this proposal appears to create a fairly straightforward class of potential beneficiaries, it glosses over a very complex history. Just to give one example, many American Indians were enslaved. At one point, there were more Native folks being shipped out of the port of Charleston than there were Africans being brought in. For the most part, Native men were sent to the West Indies to be sold there, while the women were sent to Southern plantations. So I find it really disconcerting to try to divide their descendants so starkly. More generally, this framing erases the fact that by 1619, hundreds of thousands of Africans had been enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. And there's a long and really rich history of Afro-descendant folks traveling between the Caribbean and other places in the Western Hemisphere and the US mainland prior to emancipation. And of course, many people, Haitians, for example, have migrated more recently to the US because of the toll taken in their societies by enslavement. Given all of this, a narrow focus on the lineal descendants of persons enslaved within the US, I think, tends to promote a xenophobic mindset that reifies colonially imposed state borders. It presumes the legitimacy of the state, and it affirms its claims not only to this land, but to the imposition of what Stephen Salaita calls imperative patriotism. You might think about what happened to Colin Kaepernick in that context. Finally, the logistics would just be mind-boggling. Colonialism and enslavement functioned by destroying identity, by brutally suppressing cultures, languages, and religions, by taking away names and stealing people's children. The descendants of those most harmed by these processes will be the least able to prove their lineage. And who would be deciding? Odds are it would work like blood quantum requirements for American Indians, imposed by federal agencies to limit land claims, arbitrarily imposed and relying on lists created by white federal agents after removal, meaning that many of the most traditional people, the ones who escaped and maintained their ways of life, were and remain excluded. To sum up, I fear that the result would be both divisive and inequitable. We know that any form of reparations will be used by those who benefit from the status quo to say that the issue is now resolved. You've been compensated. We don't want to hear any more complaints. To resist that and to continue the struggle for genuine reparations and empowerment, we're going to need a strong and united base. For a long time, it was really difficult to even raise the question of reparations for people of African descent. I don't think it's an accident that now, just as it's becoming recognized as a legitimate claim, the conversation has been redirected in many circumstances from a broad understanding of the wrongs and remedies at issue to a very narrow and divisive question that I think will leave us once again fighting over the scraps. Thanks.
Thank you so very much, Professor Natsu. So I have a question I'd like to raise. And before I do, Jam, I don't know if you have any comments you want to make before we get into some interactive discussion. The floor is yours.
I just wanted to uplift so far what we've heard. And for me, in addressing lineage-based and limited access reparations, it goes back to the points that many of you all have already raised. But also I wanted to add in this, I mean, we already understand the complications of identity and that being stripped away and ancestry and all of these things, but also why create another barrier? I think there's this idea that, and I'm not sure 100% where it stems from, but there's this idea that the ancestors that came before us that have been fighting for reparations for centuries, somehow they just didn't explain it right. Like they didn't use the code word, they didn't say lineage, or they didn't say this, or they didn't say that. And that's not the issue here. The issue is that we've been in a centuries-long war, as some authors would call it, against white supremacy. And it was never going to be an easy fight. It's not because we didn't phrase it a certain way or do it a certain way or exclude enough people or whatever it is. It never was because we didn't say it the right way or that our ancestors made all these mistakes on how to break down what reparative justice is. It has always just been a battle. And I think that is what people are about to see in the state of California concerning the reparations task force there. But we don't need additional barriers, and limited access reparations creates that. We need to be focused on reaching and repairing Black communities and making that as accessible as possible. And then even with trying to add in these basically fact-finding expeditions, digging into people's families' ancestries, or making it mandatory, that is something that is time consuming. That is something that is costly. And with all that time and cost, that could have been invested into the very communities that we're talking about repairing. And I also enjoyed, love that Professor Natsu mentioned Japanese Americans and Native Americans, because often people use them as a standard and say, well, they got theirs. But she's highlighting here that actually no, and a lot of harms have taken place throughout the course of reparative justice movements for those groups. They were not perfect, they were not all inclusive, and there have been problems. And if we can look at those histories and see those problems, why recreate them for ourselves? So that's all that I had to add.
So I appreciate the comments of everyone. I know Akinyele Umoja started out talking about he was the only one in his class besides his white colleague who could trace his ancestry. The vast majority of the people, were not, and that the burden was on him to have to do that. Professor Ray Winbush talked about the absurdities that there was no criteria applied to us when we were captured in Africa. The only criteria was, the color of our skin. He talked about distorted and destroyed records. He also talked about the deliberate destruction of Black records with the goal of robbing Black folk of land, and that many just don't have access to money, travel, lost family records, access to government records, et cetera, and gave the analogy of the slave catchers analogy that in order to get from one place to another, you have to show those papers, and that this whole issue of proof of lineage, particularly when it's difficult, divisive, and under-inclusive, might lead to that. So with that, my question is, the California Reparations Task Force testimonies before it, and what I presume will be coming out of their final report, is that the cure to that is the establishment of a Friedmans Bureau that would take on the burden of locating these records and the financial aspect of it and assisting people. Again, we're talking about large scale basis. We're not talking about a Bruce's Beach or Tulsa or, Chattahoochee Brick Company where Africa Town, we're not talking about, we're talking about large scale, 50 million Black folk or whatever we are. So what is your reflection with respect to having a governmental agency to be implemented as part of a legislative, process, such as a Friedmans Bureau, to be able to do these? Do you think that will fix or cure the situation? Anyone can jump in.
Well, we know what happened to the first Friedmans Bureau, first of all. It lasted a few years, and, we can talk, that's a whole historical thing that I hope I like your term to Jessica, limited access reparations. You can have a Friedmans Bureau, but see, again, I'm really concerned about why are the lineage-based people almost paranoid, and that's the only word I can use as a psychologist, paranoid about we got to make sure that the ones who deserve reparations get them. And they said, well, all of us are Africans. I've heard that, white people are Africans, all of that, and it creates this kind of paranoia that are very characteristic of a cult almost, that, we've got to exclude people more than include people. The emphasis is on exclusion. And, and then I hear some of the limited access reparations people, they'll stand up and say, my name is Joe Blow, and my father was Willie Blow, and his father was this and that, and then they go back to slavery. Well, I'm glad you can do that. But we got to think about Jamal on the street corner, who may not be able to have the records that you have, who may not have access to computers. And it's like, you know, it's again, and I'm not just trying to be rhetorical about it, but it's almost like the slave catchers stopping our ancestors on the road and said, where's your papers from your master to prove that you can go from plantation A to plantation B? And but I'm going to stop there. But I mean, there's a lot to say about this. And so, you know, the Friedmans Bureau is going to be only as good as those who are on it, how much money they got, all of that. You know, you can trust government institutions to an extent, but historically, they've been fickle lovers to all African people.
I think somebody specifically in the Q&A asked me about services like Ancestry.com and whatever, and mentioned Friedmans Bureau. I got an education. You know, I have a PhD. I've used Ancestry.com as well as AfricanAncestry.com. One of the difficulties, a lot of the records aren't there. You know, I've been able to find a lot, and I have with an education, I have access and a university job. I can get certain records, but some I can't get. And so, for instance, finding information on my father's mother, most of the women, it's, you know, it's particularly because of the patriarchy during that time, they document the men better than they do the women. In the case of my father, my paternal line, my great-grandfather was born from a slaveholder and an African woman. But there's little information I could find on an African woman because there's so much emphasis on the men, you know. So it's going to be, so is that part of my lineage not to be recognized? You know, these type of questions come up when we just do it on a lineage basis. So, you know, I think it's going to deserve a lot more conversation and a different type of perspective. Again, I just want to go to what was the harm, you know, and then how do we redress the harm? And I think Natsu raised some powerful questions in terms of what's going to make us, because I ultimately think reparations is a political question. And so if it's a political question, it's about how much power we have. Are we stronger by having allies, or are we weaker by isolating ourselves from other members of our natural community? Like was pointed out. Now, Natsu pointed out the example I want us to think about also about people, indigenous people who were sold from here to the Caribbean. I met people in Cuba whose people came from Mississippi and they're Africans there. So it becomes a complicated question, not to mention when folks come from Jamaica and they marry my grandkids, you know, you're presented with a whole nother question. And so, but I think, you know, the commissions have to figure out again, who is the class we're talking about that would have been harmed? How is it going to be redressed, and for what particular violation? And I think we can begin to come up with some ways to work that out. Again, particularly too, if it's not just a check, then if it's going to particular communities, then, you know, that presents another form that we have to think about. But it's not just, you know, one person getting. I think a lot of us have an Oprah Winfrey thing of reparations. You get 25,000. You get 25. You know, it's going to be more complicated and difficult than that, I believe, if it's going to be real reparations. And like Natsu laid out, it's restitution. You know, putting us back in the position we were in prior to the damage. Is compensation, just, you know, awarding, if you can't do restitution, giving people some sort of financial compensation. It is rehabilitation, you know, it's satisfaction.
Guarantees the
non-material things. The hard thing is going to be preventing this stuff from ever happening again, because these folks out here are crazy, you know.
So, Baba, we're going to get into some of that in a minute, but I want to give Jessica a chance to respond to this Friedmans Bureau issue. And I saw a question in the chat dealing with ancestry, African ancestry, so I want to raise that. So, Jessica?
Sure. So, on the Friedmans Bureau, I think that what Baba Akinyele was just saying about if it goes beyond cash, even with cash is an issue, but if it's a community-based thing, then you have other things you have to think through. And a primary example of this was the last California Task Force hearing, where they were still arguing over lineage, right? Trying to be super certain, trying to be super strict.
Fights broke out too, remember?
Oh yeah. And Task Force member Tamaki asked a really important question. His research and part of the report deals with Black maternal health. And we have Black women dying while giving in childbirth. We have all these things happening. And he asks, now, how do you tell a healthcare provider that got to be lineage based? Even if you have a Friedmans Bureau, you have to think through these types of things, because now we're creating another barrier. If we're going to say things like we want to repair Black maternal health and make that a part of the reparative justice plan, but then say we got to limit the access to that repair by first proving this person's ancestry, what does that look like to a healthcare provider in an emergency situation? What does that look like in terms of Black maternal health? Are we now going to say, you know, wait, before we help you, give you this extra help, show your slave papers? That kind of stuff is detrimental. We're not, I think that in our hopes of getting what we're owed or what we deserve, I think that we're missing a bigger picture that can be setting us up for an internal, it's already an internal conflict, but an internal failure that ultimately causes more harms to our communities when we need to be focused on overall healing and liberation.
So what I want to do is, there are very robust questions within the Q&A. I want to go over, raise one of them. First of all, I just want to make clear that no one on this panel is saying or feeling that anyone should be restricted from researching their ancestry if they choose. I mean, I've researched my own ancestry. In fact, we absolutely should be doing that, because that's part of the harm that was stripped from us, our cultural heritage and the like. But what we are talking about is mandated a proof of lineage as a prerequisite for a large-scale reparations package. So this is what I just want to make sure that's clear. So this first question is from Sipiwe Baleka. He says, yesterday, Illinois passed HR 292, resolution to provide DNA testing and reparations for voluntary repatriation to ancestral homelands in Africa. HR 292 resolves to, quote, providing matrilineal and patrilineal DNA testing to African ancestry to determine the ancestral lineages and territories of origins of its Black residents so that they can seek citizenship in their ancestral homelands, end of quote, and make conducting a repatriation census its immediate priority. His specific question is, with that background, do you agree this is an important part of reparatory justice, helping people to regain their lineage and their birthright?
Well, I think it's an important part. I'm not sure is necessary. Again, what trips me out about many of these, advocates of lineage is like their ahistorical understanding of events that happened to African people. for example, I mean, this is one example, the Book of Negroes, which was an actual book in Nova Scotia that was used. Many of the enslaved Africans in South Carolina, which had at one time the largest number of enslaved people, they were enslaved. Their descendants went to Canada. Many Africans escaped to Canada. You know, they were enslaved, got out of slavery, escaped from slavery, and went to Canada. Are they entitled? You know, their descendants are now Canadian citizens. Are they entitled to reparation? And this kind of xenophobic idea that somehow the American African community is totally detached from the rest of Africans throughout the world, it's just stupid. What did John Henry Clark say, Akinyele? We need to stop talking about where they dropped us off, and we need to start talking about where they picked us all up. You know, I mean, two blood brothers, for example, could have both been picked up on the coast of Africa. One dropped in Haiti, the other one dropped in Hattiesburg, if it existed during that time. And they're blood brothers. And so you said, well, we're going to, you know, give reparations to the brother that was enslaved in the United States and exclude his blood brother who was in Haiti. It's an absurd idea. And I think it's whipped up by a lot of anti-immigrationist people. And I'm telling you, we did a study a few years ago, the final call on the Minister Farrakhan, and it showed that some of the links of these groups are from white supremacists. And I'm not going to name the groups, you know, because I've been threatened to be sued about doing that. But the thing about it, we need to trace the origins of these groups. None of these groups are more than 8 years old, none of them. Why did they pop up roughly when Trump was rising up? So I think we need to question whether or not this entire lineage thing is a tool of white supremacy to distract us from the overall struggle for reparations, which is, again, always been a Pan-African project, has been inclusive of everybody.
To Brother Sifuwe's question about should, I guess, the DNA test be part of reparations, I don't think it's, yeah, of course they should pay for that, you know, because those tests are expensive as hell, number one, particularly the DNA test. But then the other question I would say is even those have limits. Again, if I trace my father's side of my family, it's only going to trace the males on that side. And then we're going to end up with a slaveholder, a white settler, you know, after we pass my great grandfather. So I won't be able to get to the lineage that way. And it won't document the women on my father's side. You feel me? So there are limits even to that, I think. But I'm not opposed to them having to compensate us to get that information. And that be a part of us getting our reparations. No, it's not an issue at all. Yeah, they should facilitate that. I'm talking about the state should, the government should facilitate that as much as possible. Is us getting the information. It's something I did not as directly connected to reparations. I just want to know who my people are and get as much information about my heritage, what makes me as a person. And that's an African thing to do, right? We call out our generations as far back as we can name. Mm-hmm. And so, and then in some cases, like many of us, the slaveholders up in there, and you know, we don't want to call that name out of a criminal. So anyway.
So let me just also say that what Brother Sifuwe, I just want to make sure that it is clear. He's talking about these tests for repatriation. Many of us who came up during the early part of the modern era reparations movement, I would say, New African Independence movement, was talking about reparations in the context of the right to self-determination. And the right to self-determination would include repatriation for those who chose that route. It would include the right to go somewhere else. We talked about Haiti or from the islands and where our families were fully separated and the like. It included the right to accept the offer of U.S. citizenship in this country and strive to make a multiracial democracy real, but it also included the right to establish an independent Black nation state on this soil, negotiate with the Native peoples, et cetera, et cetera. So he was talking about the repatriation aspect to that. I don't want to get too much into weeds on that. Jessica, can you pick out another question from the Q&A for us to discuss?
Sure. This is kind of bundling a couple of them.
Yeah, because there are over 50 questions. Yeah.
Yeah. This is bundling a couple of them because I think it's an important question to raise, and I knew that it was going to come up. But the idea that we have to do lineage or limited access based because race based is unconstitutional. So can you all speak to the legal aspects of reparative justice from that aspect? I always thought about it in the terms of harms-based anyway, but I think that I always wonder, why is it always phrased as this is race-based and lineage-based? And it's like, we're talking about harms.
Because it serves their masters to say that. And they'll quote the 14th Amendment, you can't do things under 14th. And Nkechi, you're a lawyer, you can answer this thing better than we can. But I want to say that I think the issue is, AK said, is harm. If you prove harm as a tort, and we've talked to lawyers, reparations people have talked to lawyers for years about this, it's the issue of harm. And it doesn't have anything to do with race. That's what they're saying, because they'll say, well, then, that doesn't come under the 14th Amendment. You can't have, it's an issue of harm, not race. It's harm.
So, AK, did you want to say anything to that? Because I might have a slight disagreement because we might characterize it as harm. Race is a social construct. It was made up, okay? But I'm just saying the harm was done to a certain specific group of people. And the issue that I have is, and this is a non-legal, I'm just, stating, we have to really look at using the master's tools, Audre Lorde, okay, to dismantle the master's house, okay? And as long as we stay within that rubric, what current US law says, and we try to wrangle our way in and out and about and around, they're gonna come up with all the other things. This is what they always do, okay? One of the things we need to be doing is, as we're looking at international law, as opposed to even international law, trying to put ourselves even in those constructs, what we need to do is be able to influence that so our unique experiences is part of that international frame. Right now, even the international frame, when it talks about victims, it doesn't go back generations. It talks about really direct victims, okay? Or the family members of direct victims. But our experience, unique experience that goes back generations, is not even reflected there. So as long as we just couch our remedy to what is there currently, domestically and internationally, we will always face these issues. So yes, it is harm-based, but it's harm-based to a particular,
group of people.
I will say that Aiwuyor did a lot of, did a specific memo in response to the California task force when we was talking about issues dealing with group identity, talking about issues dealing with lineage and the like. And I want to be able to share this if I can figure out how to get this in the chat, because she has a very excellent, I should say, analysis of all this as part of that. She was one of our panelists on our first Reparation Information Thought Series dealing with weaponization of race and reparations and how to combat it. Jessica, you were going to bundle some other questions there.
Sure. While I do that, I also wanted to uplift that even in talking about race-based, which we usually aren't, but even in talking about race-based reparations. Justice Katanji Brown actually started, I won't say throwing a bone, but I don't have the exact quote that in front of me, but she believes that the founding fathers left room for race-based legislation because they were trying to repair the harms as they did their various amendments. So she even looks at that differently in these conversations about affirmative action. And I think that her arguments need to be studied, because even as we move forward, we're still going to have to address harms, race, etc. And even with folks that are advocating lineage or limited access are going to have to figure out ways to address race as well, because you really can't disconnect race from reparations, or you really can't you can't erase Africanity from reparations. And I think that's what's happening here. That's what some people are attempting to do. Yeah. And once you do that, we get into levels of erasure that actually cause more harm. Let me see if I can find something. So we just addressed the law part of it.
While you're looking for that question, I just want to say, we're the only people that are taught to hate our history, and now we got Black folk teaching other Black folk to hate, despise, cut off, don't talk about, saying the word African. Oh, when you hear that word, something's wrong. When you hear that word, you should be rejoicing in your ancestors. But that's a rhetorical thing I just said, but I really think it's important, very important.
Malcolm X said you can't, love the tree and hate the root.
See, Malcolm would be questioned under that because his mother was from Grenada.
Yeah.
According to that, Malcolm would not qualify for reparations.
Our African heritage is one of the things that bonds us as a people. To help identify. That's one of the things we share. So it shouldn't be disputed.
So I was looking for Aiwuyor Ayatoro's questions because she put 2 in the chat. She says, and Cobra spent a number of years developing the harms 5 injury areas that have been updated: some education, criminal punishment, peoplehood, health, including mental health, wealth, poverty. How should we go further to identify and develop the question of injury?
I think that you'll see, I remember, thousands of years ago when I wrote Should America Pay, that, you could not even find that much research on the 5 harms in Cobra. Now you can see much more literature on that. That is, I think I say in Belinda's petition that documenting a movement that is still in progress is very difficult to do in a book. But I'm on the Journal of Black Studies, and we get more and more articles about reparations that are documenting those harms that Aiwuyor just spoke about. And so I think the research is abundant and is getting more prevalent, and more people are doing research on it.
I think when that question of peoplehood, and she addressed it, and it's linked to that question of restitution. Putting people back in the situation they were in prior to the injury. And so when years ago, when the Republic of New Africa called for a plebiscite or a vote, but like Black Panther Party called for the same thing, it falls in line with that. One of the things that was a harm was the taking away of our sense of peoplehood and our self-determination. And this is why people like, Queen Mother Moore, who's thought to be the mother of the reparations movement, also talked about self-determination as for us as a people. But we kind of limit it. I think we only think of it in terms of getting that check, as opposed to other areas of our lives where that have been violated by the folks who control us. I think I saw in the chat or in the questions, one brother, Kwasi Akwamu, talked about settler colonialism, which Natsu Saito wrote a book on. When we talk about structural racism, that's another terminology for it. We live under settler colonialism. And again, it's a vestige of slavery. So
let me just respond also, because we are history in the making right here, right now. And Dr. Ray, you're correct. Back in the day when NCOBA first came up with those 5 injury areas, one of the specific reasons, and that was pursuant to the litigation strategies, that I forgot what it was, that Aiwuyor headed up as part of NCOBA, was that we were getting slaughtered in the courts with the legal issues of statute of limitations and laches, and the like. So we said, well, if we're not, if we don't limit it to reparations for slavery, when we talk about the vestiges, which, as you said, Dr. Akinyele, we were talking about long ago in the New African Independence Movement, the vestiges of slavery are the living legacies of the enslavement era, and specifically, as NCOBA identified, the health, the wealth, the education, the mass incarceration, the criminal punishment system, and the peoplehood, nationhood. You will be able to capture all of that because they were ongoing and they're still happening and occurring today. I always say the harms from the enslavement era and beyond were multifaceted. Thus, the remedies must be multifaceted as well. And that's what we brought in it. It's not just a check. I must admit, when I was 16 years old and selling Black Panther papers on the streets of Washington, D.C., that point number 3, it talked about, basically, it was talking about the check. But the whole philosophy has matured since that time. It's not just, now this is a matter of debate and discussion, because some folk don't feel that there should be any type of direct payments at all. I personally believe, that it should be direct payments plus. Okay. Absolutely. And that is where we are in the history of in the making right now. What does that plus mean? What manifestations will it take? And that's where we are talking about broadening the issues. So anyway, what's next there, Jam, in terms of the Q&A?
So there is a question here, D. Seligman. What about the reality of somewhat limited available funds, especially given our current political reality? Does that limitation mean we need some way of prioritizing who gets reparations first, but that the pool of eligibility could be widened later? Are we dealing with political realities of what can be done, but structural racism harms should also be addressed by policy changes?
I think when Natsu Saito brought up, we just have to be careful about the divide and conquer piece on that, and she pointed out some examples of how they gave Japanese, quote unquote, Americans reparations, but Japanese people who were interned from the South and Central American countries that the United States brought here, right? They put them in concentration camps, but they get no reparations under the compensation that came in that act in the 1980s. So we have to, again, just be aware of the divide and conquer potential for some of these proposals. And are we strengthened by having more unity or being divided? We just have to, put it in that context.
I think another thing is that we need to do a study about what money is in the United States. Right now we hear this big debate over raising the debt ceiling in the United States, and we act like there's this money there, this finite pool of money in Washington, D.C. somehow, and that if you pay reparations, or in California or any place, that somehow that money will be depleted if you give it to African people. Money doesn't work like that. Read about, how do you think, when we were in the middle of a recession, that you give money right now to, what's the country over there? Zelensky.
Ukraine.
Right, Ukraine. I mean, it ain't like money is like, well, United States only has a certain amount of money. And
right.
Give reparations to these people. We're going to we're going to run out of money. It don't work like that. Study the Federal Reserve System. Study how, we're on a fiat currency and things like this. Again, I wish that some of these limited access reparationists would read more and study more.
These people spend money on what they want to.
That's right.
Like you said, trade is a priority. The checkbook is open.
Always.
I don't know if I should make this analogy, but during COVID, everybody got a check too. I'm just saying, the situation in Ukraine, and everybody and anybody, except when it comes to us. I'm not going to buy into that limited availability of resources. And also, again, there are a lot of creative ways in which things are done. April 15th just passed, or whenever it was, we had to pay up to the government. I'm just saying there are lots of ways in which a reparatory justice package can be achieved, and non-payment of taxes could be one. There's also a thing is, does everything come all at once, or is it something that's going to stretch out over time, every year or something, or these are the things that should be, and maybe they are, the reparation task force and commissions propping up all over in cities, and states are looking very carefully at these issues as well. So some of these creative mechanisms, we're in this time now where we can really begin to visualize what it can actually mean. Okay, as opposed to getting bogged down in divisive, under-inclusive, and difficult measures of measurement.
And another thing, we're talking about divisiveness. Some of these reparations groups, why don't y'all get together? I'm not speaking to y'all, of course, but why don't the FBA talk to ADOS, is split, and talk to Friedman? Somebody told me about another group. I think it was you, Jessica, told me about another group. I hadn't even heard of that. They're splitting up, and why don't they get together? But that's another rhetorical comment, AK.
So I see this question. I wanted to ask it mostly because I also wanted to hear your thoughts, but I also wanted an opportunity to respond to it. Reparations this is Kenzo Jackson. Reparations is a specific claim for those who were enslaved. It's a debt owed for the free labor. As long as you can trace your lineage to the 1870 census, you're entitled to the claim. Why should other people be included on a claim they're not entitled to? It's like filing an insurance claim for an accident and your cousin trying to get in on the claim and he wasn't in the car. So again, why should people be included that weren't here?
I don't want to even respond to that, because I think, with all due respect, it's an uninformed question. It's a question that, you could spend 1 hour on that, question that is uninformed. So I'll let somebody else do that one.
Again, if the harm is for racial slavery in a specific place, that applies to that. But if it's talking about excessive policing, if it's talking about health disparities, if it's talking about apartheid, that goes beyond that 1870 census. So, and again, we talked about, even there might be some of us who weren't covered. I'm talking about some of us who were enslaved in this country. One of my ancestors was kidnapped in the 1860s, right? We, kidnapped by some white folks after emancipation. And this is on my father's mother's side. And so, we have a whole lot of things we'd have to address. I think that could be one tool to document it, but then who are we eliminating? That's the question.
I think, I think that I'm not sure if it's being miscommunicated or misunderstood, but I don't think any of us are against documenting ancestry. It's the weaponizing it.
That's right.
And making it prerequisite and creating new barriers with it. One of the things we have to understand, and this is what I really am pleading for people to understand, is These limitations, this limited access will harm African Americans before anyone else. It will place barriers on our communities. If your concern is descendants of people that were enslaved in the United States, please understand it's over 30 million of us. They could not get an accurate count on the 2020 census.
That's right.
What makes you think there's an accurate count on the 1870 census? It's so much information that has been either lost or denied, or so many people that were not were not documented in certain ways. I have an ancestor that I know is using 2 different names on his documents because he didn't trust the government. My great granddaddy that escaped off a plantation. So it's difficult to find anything past him. But the point is, we really have to come to terms with and understand accessibility and really put the whole ahead of the individual. And I really think people are thinking that people can just hop on ancestry.com and we can't get an accurate census count.
So let me just, I'm sorry. I just saw there were a couple of questions in the chat about Queen Mother Moore, and I just want to set the record straight with respect to Queen Mother, and Ray and AK, if you wanted to jump in there, to Queen Mother Moore, who we call the mother of the modern era reparations movement, who hailed from the Garvey movement from the 20s, was active in every single reparations movement of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way up until the time of her death. She was a staunch, what we call New African, and again, the issue of reparations, she influenced just about everybody that I know with respect to that. If there appears to be some controversy over something that she wrote or terms that she was using or something along those lines, do any one of you all want to address that? But for someone who sat at Queen Mother Moore's feet,
Right,
I can tell you unequivocally, she was a Pan-Africanist and she was a Black nationalist. Okay, go on.
But see, this is COINTELPRO. I was one of these groups, I forget which one it was, about a year ago, they asked me to participate in this Twitter thing. You can talk online, and it was all set up. And I got off after I cussed them out. And, I'm literally, I just cussed them out. But this sister read to me from Queen Mother and said, do you know she used the word Negroes? This was 1963. And this sister probably was born in, 1980 or something like that. She didn't know what she was talking about. I said, well, okay, yeah, she did use the term Negro. Well, why would a Black person use Negro? And I want to say, Negro, if you had been in 1963, you would have been using Negro, okay? Right. So, this whole, some of this stuff, but see, this is a COINTELPRO. Let's attack Queen Mother Moore, the mother of the movement, the modern reparations movement.
No, they're not trying to attack her. They're trying to take her away from what her philosophies were all about, and they're trying to pigeonhole it into something else to justify what they're doing and saying. That's what it is.
Queen Mother Moore, I met when I was 18 years old. And just about every time she came to Los Angeles, I would escort her to where she needed to go. I've written an article. I was trying to find a link to put on the chat about my reflection on Queen Mother Moore. Queen Mother Moore felt part of our reparations was recovering our African identity. She said that our people suffer from something she called oppression psychoneurosis, that we have forgotten who the hell we are, and we've forgotten about our links to our motherland. So that was first and foremost in terms of the psychological repair she felt we needed as a people to recover our connections to our motherland. Mama Nkechi mentioned New African. Queen Mother Moore is the one who coined that term. for the Republic of New Africa. She's the first signer of this Declaration of Independence. And again, she tied self-determination and a whole bunch of other things. She would argue that how are we going to have reparations and we still have political prisoners?
That's right.
Can you say we've been repaired and we still got, Rochelle McGee and other people, Jamil Al-Amin, incarcerated? So I think people need to really study her.
They don't do that.
Well, actually, there's a biography coming out on her soon by Professor Ashley Farmer. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that.
Was a former Garveyite.
Yes,
So now Queen Mother Moore, you got to really study her. And I see we got some information in Reparations Education Project.org on her. And I'll see if I can find my article as well.
So we have 5 more minutes. I could try to get another question from the chat, which is basically.
I just want to make sure folks know that there are 99 plus questions in the Q&A, 99 plus, and we had nearly 150 people on this call. So go ahead, Jessica.
I guess it's an issue people are interested in.
It really is. I mean, I think it's someone asked, and I was going to come back to it, like, why are we focusing on this? And I'm not sure people are understanding how big of an issue or conversation this has been or has kind of taken over in the reparation space in terms of moving forward, in terms of local reparations and national reparations. And so, I would love to not focus on this. I do think it's we over focusing on it. Everybody is over focusing on it. But there has to be a discussion. There has to be ongoing discussions about this because of the current state of the reparations movement and the future of the reparations movement. And if we don't work through these things, I mean, I'm not sure what we're headed to in terms of, especially as there are many different local reparations initiatives popping up across the country. So we do have to address this or at least tackle it in some way. So I don't really see a new question.
What I'd like to do is let Akinyele, Dr. Umoja and Dr. Winbush have like a 1 or 2 minute closing statements, if that's okay, if we can do that with however you want to kind of wrap up what you were saying. I will say that there is a video, there will be a video recording of this that we can make available. We'll make available to everyone who are registered. Will also be on my website, Reparation Education Project's website, and probably on National Black Cultural Information Trust's website as well. Dr. Umoja, you want to start?
Most definitely. I think I think it's an important question because I think our people need to have more conversations about the reparations issues. We're going to be confronted with it soon. And so I think if our people are really educated about it, then we can ensure that these commissions and stuff do well-informed proposals. So having these conversations, I think, are valuable. I'm glad that a whole lot of people showed up, and I'm glad, that you all had this platform so we can have this constant conversation on the issue of reparations. So I'll just close with that.
And I just want to say, to the advocates of Lineage, to read more, don't fight each other. And I'm talking about physical fights. Don't fight each other, love each other, and try to be cooperative with those who have been in this struggle for years, and don't denounce your ancestors. And ironically, don't denounce your lineage of being an African person either. That's all.
So I'm going to let Jam close out, but I just want to provide a quote that's in my book, Reparations from Fire, How White Spreading Across America. And this is actually a quote from our sister attorney, Aiwuyor, who testified before the California Reparations Task Force. And then as she emphasized, and I quote, she said, people who look like me but are not descendant from enslaved Africans suffer the injuries of the legacies of slavery. That is the major crime of slavery and its legacies. It imprinted on peoples who look like me a presumption of inferiority, a presumption of criminality, a presumption of loose morals, a presumption that leads to being unable to obtain jobs and housing of the same caliber of whites. Money reparations to only those who meet a burden of proof of descending from an enslaved African, leave those who are victimized by the legacy of slavery with an injury without remedies. I just wanted to do that quote. And Jam, why don't you close us out and thank everyone and all that jazz.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor Raymond, Professor Akinyele. Thank you to Professor Natsu for providing your video and commentary. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening for the Reparation Information Thought Series. We'll have another panel discussion coming up soon. In the meantime, you can look at the videos and look at more of our work at reparationeducationproject.org and NBCIT.org and aboutreparations.org. Mm-hmm. And if you have any additional questions for the presenters or us, you can send us an email at info@nbcit.org, and I'll make sure that the appropriate person gets your commentary or question. But thank you. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, stay tuned for the next in the series of the Reparation Information Thought Series. We will be resuming again in September, so stay tuned.
Thanks, everyone.
Folks. See y'all.
Free the land.
Free the land.
Free the land by any means necessary.
Necessary.